Hello, everybody. My name is Jutta. I have the pleasure to be the chair of the next session on Aufklärung 2.0 or Enlightenment 2.0. I was already was thinking of maybe we should talk of 3.0. I'm not sure about that. And maybe only very briefly, I think the idea, as it popped up when we had our last meeting of the DFG network in Paderborn, and it was really of how to address on the one hand, the problem of fake news, of the idea that the socio-political order of Western democracy seem not to function anymore, and that there's a tendency towards irrationalism, and what is the role of affect in this whole setting, and also the feeling that affect was in the theoretical debate, affect was long kind of the counter term to rationality, and I think the focus or the perspective or the question was how can we figure or conceptualize still the idea of rationality in a post-metaphysical way, or is this still possible? I think that's the big frame of the panel, so I mean everybody has his or her own focus on that. And just to give you a short idea of how it works, I think there will be the three presentations, and there will be only brief questions at the end of every presentation, so that we have a little bit more of the time for overall discussion at the end of the panel. Okay, I think the first presentation is by Markus Rautzenberg. And I mean, there's more on the people in this wonderful little leaflet Bernd and Marie-Louise organized, so I will try to keep myself very short because there's not much time. So the first presentation is by Markus Rautzenberg on alien thinking, on the return of the Sublime. Markus Rautzenberg is professor of philosophy at the Folkwang University, and prior to that he was chair of media cultures at the Leuphana University in Lüneburg. So welcome, Markus, and thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you, Jutta, very much for this kind introduction. Indeed, our first idea was that affect is embedded in a long tradition of Western philosophy of the 20th century, which was about to deconstruct Western metaphysics and Western rationality since early modern times, and the affective turn is a kind of late bloomer, so to speak, of this kind of development. And the question was if Enlightenment 2.0 could be conceived in regards of implementing this criticism on rationality. And this was our starting point, which is of course a very big kind of topic. So we're just going to scratch a bit on the surface, which I am going to do now. In his work After Finitude, Mathias Fuchs states, by correlation we mean the idea according to which we only ever have access to the correlation between thinking and being, and never to either term considered apart from one another. For Mathias Fuchs, one of the main protagonists of speculative realism, the original sin of contemporary philosophy begins with Immanuel Kant, who in speculative realism takes the place that Descartes occupied for 20th century philosophy. It is obvious, however, that the real target, the elephant in the room, so to speak, is the concept of semiomorphic knowledge that has dominated the 20th century in the shape of the now infamous linguistic turn. In fact, the notion of mediality and mediation in itself is targeted. Generally speaking, the modern philosopher's two-step consists in this belief in the primacy of the relation over the related terms, a belief in the constitutive power of reciprocal relation. We just need to remember basic concepts of linguistics according to Saussure to realize what is alluded to here. His semiology depends on the notion of semiosis as driven by arbitrarity and difference. These are the core concepts, of course. Semiosis, and that is one of Saussure's famous innovations that Derrida just had to emphasize later. Semiosis doesn't rely on representation or mimesis of the world, but exclusively on inner systemic processes of differentiation. Saussure's semiology, therefore, is a theory of relations and relationality par excellence. Constructivist approaches like Niklas Luhmann's system theory or Deleuze's philosophy have therefore also run into the Kantian trap, according to Meillassoux. The same applies to theories of mediality as well as for the ubiquitous notion of the net or network. The list is quite long. You can add to it. For today, I'm not concerned with the question whether Meillassoux is right in his attempt to make Kant a kind of scapegoat for the failure of modern philosophy. What matters is the thesis that for all these approaches, an outside of perception, knowledge, or semiosis, regardless if we call it thing in itself or transcendental signified, this outside is kind of unreachable. With keeping this outside out of reach, a marginalization takes place, and it is this marginalization that speculative realism is concerned with. It is therefore crucial to take note of this perceived insufficiency of constructivist thought as it is articulated in speculative realism. For Meillassoux, for example, a thinking of the big outside has become impossible because of this. Furthermore, speculative realism has embarked to escape this supposedly self-inflicted solipsism by promoting a kind of alien thinking, as I would like to call it for the time being. It is Meillassoux' declared intention to enable philosophy to think in foreign territory again, to be entirely elsewhere. And I quote, "For it could be that contemporary philosophers have lost the great outdoors," which is a peculiar translation, das große Außen, the absolute outside of pre-critical thinkers, that outside which was not relative to us, and which was given as indifferent to its own givenness, to be what it is, existing in itself regardless of whether we are thinking of it or not. That outside with which thought could explore with a legitimate feeling of being on foreign territory, of being entirely elsewhere. The English translation makes it sound like a trip to the countryside with a little exploring. But the great outdoors is not as nice as it sounds. It is a metaphor for something so alien that it cannot be understood, measured, or perceived. It is more like exploring an alien planet, not so much a stroll among trees. It is a resonance of Schelling's absolute, something genuinely incomprehensible, and this is the reason why H.P. Lovecraft, the poet of the unnameable, is so popular among speculative realists. It is a form of terror that lurks here at the outskirts of our known universe. But even better than Lovecraft in this regard is John Milton. The other shape, if shape it might be called, that shape had none, distinguishable in member, joint, or limb, or substance might be called, that shadow seemed, for each seemed either black he stood as night, fierce as 10 furies, terrible as hell, and shook a deadly dart. What seemed his head the likeness of a kingly crown had on. This is a picture of death itself, which is fascinating in its ability to be very iconic without being really descriptive. Edmund Burke, still very much under the influence of his literary studies at Dublin's Trinity College, used Milton's impressive talent for describing the undescribable as an ideal example to illustrate his own notion of the sublime, perhaps the most impressive but surely the most influential part of his early work, a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful. And I quote from this, Hence arises the great power of the sublime that far from being produced by them, it anticipates our reasoning and hurries us on by an irresistible force, end quote. At the base of the sublime, terror reigns supreme, a fear of getting lost, of being hurried away by irresistible forces. One of Burke's main examples is the ocean, a metaphorical realm that will remain influential from Kant to Nietzsche. Burke argues that both a vast landscape and a great ocean instill affects of awe and admiration in the mind of the onlooker because of their vastness, their spatial dimension. But only the ocean is able to induce a state of the sublime, according to Burke. This is because, in addition to its vastness, it can evoke a sense of terror, because the ocean is amorphous and endless to the human perception, always harboring the risk of drowning, even under a calm surface, an aspect that together with awe and admiration results in the sublime. And I quote, "Indeed, terror is in all cases whatsoever either more openly or latently the ruling principle of the sublime." Therefore, the sublime cannot be the medium of clara et distincta, of clear thinking. The sublime is not a realm of philosophy, but of shock and awe. It is an affective medium, a medium of intensity. Burke alludes to the rhetorical tradition, and I quote, "It is one thing to make an idea clear, and another to make it affecting to the imagination." End quote. The sublime is connected to the vague, obscure, and the fragmented. It is a realm of affect and not ratio. And I quote again, "It is our ignorance of things that causes all our admiration." Nope. "It is our ignorance of things that causes all our admiration and chiefly excites our passions. Knowledge and acquaintance make the most striking causes affect but little." End of quote. This kind of amazement interwoven with fear and terror leads us away from philosophical aesthetics and into the area of religious phenomena, or to be more precise, it shows the close interrelation of both. It was the historian of religion Rudolf Otto who described the sublime regarding religion as mysterium tremendum, that together with mysterium fascinans, for him lies at the core of religious experience. He explicitly refers to the sublime, however, without directly citing Burke. Otto translates tremendum with schauervoll, the German schauervoll, which in turn is the translation in which Burke's term astonishment arrived in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. Schauervoll, astonishing, describes a kind of the sublime that should not be confused with fear. Considering the tremendum, fear is more like an analogy. And I quote Rudolf Otto in German, I didn't have a translation. Sie hat zwar Ähnlichkeit mit der Furcht und kann darum durch sie analogisch angedeutet werden, selbst jedoch ist sie etwas ganz anderes als ein sich fürchten. Zitat Ende. Shower or astonishment is always connected to holiness and the sacred and refers to Erzitternis ergriffen sein, which I'd like to translate with a trembling kind of being awestruck. Erzitternis ergriffen sein, by the numinous, a term that was invented by Otto for this occasion. What is most interesting here is that this shower or astonishment is not just a petrification of all senses or intellectual capacities. It is not ratio, not ratio, and not effect, but something equally distant from both. The feeling of holy reverence is a mode of world apprehension, of being in and out of the world at the same time, that is situated between ratio and instinct, a category that is a kind of its own, alien to both of them, dissolving the dichotomy between these categories in the process. This is the important part. I would like to propose that in speculative realism, there's a comeback of Burke's and Otto's concept of the sublime as an epistemological and aesthetic tool to arrive at notions that not only allows to be in foreign territory, but to transform philosophy itself into what I called alien thinking. Alien not only in the sense that philosophy arrives in foreign territory or the great outdoors, like Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. This would still be a patronizing mode of perception, a kind of colonial thinking. Alien thinking would also mean a transformation of thinking itself, an alienation from its own concepts, terms, and notions. Foreign territory would then be the great inside as well as the great outside. Meillassoux was talking about, albeit again dissolving the binary notion of inside and outside, that is not helpful here. This is what radical anti-rationalism would be about. Enlightenment 2.0 would therefore be first and foremost a self-alienation of thinking. This is of course nothing new. It would be the completion of the project of psychoanalysis in the medium of philosophy. The insight that the most alien is our own thinking and, one might add, our own feeling. This alien thinking is of course deeply rooted in the attempt to think of the world in a non-anthropocentric manner. Here, the nobilization of the object and material cultures become important, and it's because of this that speculative realism counts Bruno Latour as one of their own. However, according to Meillassoux and others, the alienness of this world of things or nature, as correlationist thinking would have called it, has to be understood as absolute in the sense of Schelling, that is, it is absolutely incomprehensible for human thought. Every relation between subject and object is severed, and it is here that terror as a part of the sublime comes back in full force, but now as an epistemological category. It was Adorno who insisted that the sublime should be banned from the realm of politics, and today we can understand it even better when confronted with the alien thinking of speculative anti-rationalism and its political branches called accelerationism. I still can't do it in English. This political theory that is again very Freudian now in its love for the concept of the death drive, and that has fans like Steve Bannon and Nick Land, looks a lot like apocalyptical political theory from the Weimar Republic. So the sublime has devastating effects when it comes to politics, but what about philosophy? Following Adorno again, one of the most influential theorists of the sublime in the 20th century, the answer is ambivalent. Do we need to be cautious when using the concept of the sublime? Yes. Do we need to banish and forget it as a whole? No, because Adorno's reading of the sublime does not sever the bonds between subject and object, but sees the sublime as a mode that allows the great outside, so to speak, to appear as part of subjectification itself. For him, the sublime is not, as it was for Immanuel Kant, a sign of human supremacy over nature, but an appearance, a showing of self of nature within humanity, showing that the subject in its bodily existence is of course nature from the beginning. Outside and inside finally begin to appear as false alternatives. Here, aesthetic and epistemological aspects of the sublime intermingle in a way that for Adorno is of course dialectical. The point of the matter is, though, that there is the interdependence of in and outside, that the interdependence of in and outside is not relational in the sense of correlationism, but recursive and integral. And I quote the famous ending of the aesthetic theory, which is untranslatable for me, I'm sorry. Am Ende wäre das ästhetische Verhalten zu definieren als die Fähigkeit, irgend zu erschauern. Das Schauervolle kommt hier wieder rein, so als wäre die Gänsehaut das erste ästhetische Bild. Was später Subjektivität heißt, sich befreiend von der blinden Angst des Schauers, ist zugleich dessen eigene Entfaltung. Nichts ist Leben am Subjekt, als dass es erschauert. Reaktion auf den totalen Bann, die ihn transzendiert. Bewusstsein ohne Schauer ist das Verdinglichte. Jener, darin Subjektivität sich regt, ohne schon zu sein, ist aber das vom anderen angerührt sein. Jenem bildet die ästhetische Verhaltensweise sich an, anstatt es sich untertan zu machen. Solche konstitutive Beziehung des Subjekts auf Objektivität in der ästhetischen Verhaltensweise vermählt Eros und Erkenntnis. It is impossible for me to translate this last entry in Adorno's aesthetic theory, but one sentence lasts for me, at least one sentence. Astonishment wherein subjectivity stirs without being yet means being touched by the other. The integration of the other or the outside is the seed of subjectivity. This is the important idea. Astonishment as part of the sublime is the very mode in which subjectivity stirs at the threshold of being. Thank you very much.
Wonderful talk. So, brief questions.
Thank you very much I very much enjoyed that presentation, and I wondered if you would say a few words about the concept of the sublime with respect to, I mean, clearly its heartland is in philosophy and in aesthetics, but it seems to me that it has transdisciplinary potential as a concept, and where it plays out in, as I would understand it, in the social sciences, is through the concept of the liminal, for example, as articulated by Van Gennep and Victor von Turner, and Victor Turner. And in psychology, the concept of the limen is at play in Helmholtz and early psychophysics as the threshold, the transformative threshold of conscious experience. So I wondered if you would go along with that kind of tracing of the concept of the subliminal into those other territories, as it were.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting indeed, and I would really like to trace it like this. But it is very obvious, I think, that Burke's concept, as dangerous it is for political, this is what Lyotard and Adorno later was about, but it captures a kind of liminal of transcending motion, like emotio, no? Something in motion that comes back as, like in psychoanalysis, comes back in full force, and it comes even harder back, so to speak, when you ignored it. And Burke's Sublime is much more a precursor of Nietzsche's Dionysian than of Kant's notion of the sublime. This is the strand, so to speak, that arrives at speculative realism. This was just my analysis. No, Mathias doesn't speak about the sublime or Burke or anything. They're not interested in this. This is my kind of reading of speculative realism, which I have many problems with. I'm not this alien thinking, this thinking in the outside, in the great outdoors, which is kind of cute translation, is what is interesting about it. A self-alienation of thinking, to be alien again, not just to the outside, which is always the case, but to the inside itself. I don't think this was an answer, but...
Okay, but only if it's a brief question.
Oh, no.
Otherwise, we postpone.
I would like to ask Markus if he really thinks that Mathias brings in something new. If you compare it with the La différence en soi chez Deleuze, La pensée du dehors chez Foucault, I mean, we had this figure already within post-structuralism, and the interesting thing was that it was always at the limit between inside and outside, and it was always an abstract something. So I have the impression it's just a gesture of another Überwindung, which we do not so much appreciate nowadays, or which we do not need, maybe even, because we have them. but the problem is rather how to introduce them again or how to see both sides, the immanent and the transcendental moment of these figures. Is it short enough?
You are absolutely right. I have alluded it when I thought I could discover that the real enemy is the semiomorphic or the semiotic paradigm of the 20th century. You could very well reiterate or redescribe the whole of speculative realism as a kind of Oedipal movement against their fathers, which you already Oedipal movement against those. They are not mentioning any of them. They just pretend like post-structuralism was never there. The whole point of correlationism, the whole point of this notion of correlationism is to get rid of the whole structuralist, especially post-structuralist movement. They started, speculative realism started in 2007, 2 years, I think, after Derrida's death. And it's you can very much say it's an Oedipal movement. If it is philosophically viable, it's very much in question indeed.
So,
thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I have now a bad role of the one who's pressing forward. But I want to go to our next talk, which is by Mathias Fuchs. The title of the talk is Esoterics. Matthias is an artist, a musician, and media scholar, and I think what might be most important is a pioneer in artistic ways of designing games, if I put it correct. And at the moment he is professor at Leuphana University in Lüneburg at the Institute of Culture and Aesthetics. Sorry for making it short. But please.
Thank you. Ist das Markus? Yes, hello. I would like to start with something that is not at all sublime, but it's very, very profane. It's an everyday experience, but it is a footnote to a remark that Marie-Louise Angerer yesterday made about the permanent delays of the DHL delivery people that keep you in an affective state that is quite annoying. And what happened to me this morning when I went to Potsdam is I had to get a train from Berlin, and the Deutsche Bahn, the German railroad company, they have a wonderful thing now. They have an application that is called the DB Navigator, which does not only allow you to find the train that you want to track, but it has a live alert system which tells you if something goes wrong with the train that you wanted to take. So I started in the morning at 6:30 and made my way to the station, and it said, all of a sudden, ding, email, unfortunately your train is delayed by 20 minutes. And I said, okay, I have another coffee. Then I again got an email that said, we have found out that you will not reach your connecting train. Thank you for traveling with Deutsche Bahn. So I said, okay, thanks God there is an alternative train router there. And so I found an alternative train. I was looking for the station and for the platform for that. And then I got another alert which said, bing, the train you have chosen now has been delayed due to delays that other trains that had to carry the wagons to the station have happened. So I was in a state of permanently checking this little device of whether there would be another problem like rain, suicide, delay of trains that are somewhere in Magdeburg or in the north of Denmark. And I could not really have this feeling of enjoying a train ride as I did in former times by sitting down, looking out of the window, having a coffee. But that's just a statement on the affective states that this technology sometimes imposes on us. What I would really like to do is to talk about something that our research network did during the last few years, and that was to trace down the Ideengeschichte or the idea history of certain notions that are relevant to the field of affective studies. And these terms that we have looked at notions like affective attunement, that I will talk about today, affective politics, affective alter politics. And I will want to find out, are there maybe roots to these notions that Masumi has overseen and that are not really well represented in the discussions about affective media and affective technologies? Let's see what Masumi says in his keywords about this fragile notion of affective politics. He says, and he begins with an excuse, this might not sound political, at least in the sense that we usually understand the political. And then he goes forward and comes up with a statement that I think since the days of Leni Riefenstahl, nobody would have seriously considered to be made. He said, aesthetics brings the collectivity of shared events to the fore, and he continues, a multiple bodily potential for what might come. In another section, also in the keywords, he says, the event always has the potentiality to effectively attune a multiplicity of bodies to its happening. And affective politics is inductive. Bodies can be induced into or attuned to certain regions of tendency, futurity, and potential. The problem that a German reader, or even worse, an Austrian reader like myself, has with these lines is that if we hear these words of Körper, Gemeinschaft, and Zukunft, that is body, community, future, in one sentence, we are very, very strongly reminded of Nazi propaganda and of how Leni Riefenstahl and others motivated explained of how their artwork works. In Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph des Willens, there is very much a tendency to mingle the body, the community, and the nation into one thing that becomes a whole. And Walter Benjamin, of course, warned us about that when he talked about the aestheticization of the political. He said, so geht es, I first quote him in German and then I try to translate him, so geht es die Ästhetisierung der Politik, welche der Faschismus betreibt. Der Kommunismus antwortet ihm mit der Politisierung der Kunst. Famous statement from 1936. This is to say in English, such is the aestheticizing of politics as practiced by fascism. Communism replies by politicizing art. He also says that fascism provides with the possibility to express the desire only, but not to have the right to live the desire. And Zizek comments on Benjamin's statement in a publication in 2004, where he says the main root of fascism is actually the elevation of the social body into an aesthetic, organic whole. And this is, I'm very much afraid of, with all sympathies to Masumi, something that a German socialized reader often has when he reads these notions of Körper, Gemeinschaft, and Zukunft in one sentence. Or Markus Rautzenberg once said in a conversation to me that he thinks when he hears these terms together that der bewegte Volkskörper is not very far away. That is the Nazi term for the moving body of the nation. So that is how Leni Riefenstahl in Triumph der Wille kind of visualized the movement of a whole nation which has lost individuality and just melts into one single body. I would like to look at this particular moment in history, like the 1930s, 40s, and go across the Atlantic Ocean for a moment and put two other examples on the table here to discuss of whether Masumi maybe had a blind spot in his theory on very, very dangerous aspects of his aestheticization of politics. One would be very, very early cybernetics, Norbert Wiener and Ross Ashby, and the other one is a spiritual community called the Emissionaries of the Divine Light. The Emissionaries of the Divine Light were a group of people who considered themselves scientists, but also healers, and they were led by a guy called Lloyd Arthur Maker, who founded the organization and said that he has developed a healing practice where he would create a triangle in between God, the patient, and the chiropractician to heal problems in the body by letting loose the divine light. And this was a haptic procedure, so he had to touch the patient, but by touching the patient, he would transmit the divine light into the body of the patient. And Lloyd Arthur Maker made a lot of experiments with that. He founded a community that grew quickly in the United States. He first was in Nashville, Tennessee, then he bought himself a ranch for his sect that was called the Sunshine Ranch, and there he found out that he does not even have to touch the patient now. He could do it from a distance of 20 centimeters first, then for 1 meter's distance, and the healing and this transmission of the divine light still worked very well, according to his reports. There were also serious researchers who became interested in his method, so he was invited to universities to present his things, and the Central Intelligence Agency became also interested in his projects. Actually, when his plane crashed in the late 40s, he, his wife, and one of his disciples, Albert Eckerly, died, and the rumor went that the CIA had shot down the plane. But the sect went on with further developments in this technology of GPC, the God-Patient Chiropractic technology, by now saying that 20 centimeters is actually still not the distance that is a limit to our healing practices. We can heal across the whole globe by some kind of telepathic healing process. So the followers of Maker and Eckerly established a clinic where they said, well, even if you're in Tokyo or in Mexico City, we will heal you from the distance by redirecting the divine light. It is might sound like silly stuff, but it was taken very, very seriously by many people in the United States before the developments of cybernetics actually happened. And there was a meeting in 1942, which was one of the predecessor meetings of the Macy Conference series, which was called the Cerebral Inhibition Meeting. And what serious researchers like Norbert Wiener, Ross Ashby, Gregory Bateson, Margaret Mead, Warren McCulloch, and others then tried to find out is whether you could create something like a hypnotic transmission to be used as a teleological process with the aim of controlling a remote system. So they were really trying out that during these conferences whether you could, and you can see why Wiener was interested in this controlling aspect, but not in a machinic way by turning knobs and buttons, but via hypnosis. This group later on became a group that met for regular meetings, and Wiener and Ashby found the title for this group that they called it with a tongue-in-cheek title, the Teleological Society. So there were very close similarities in between what the spiritual people and the esoteric people and serious science did at that point. What I find also interesting is that these were the days when wireless transmission became something like a top topic, not only in the USA but also on the continent, where ham radio prospered. That was amateur radio. A lot of people tried to communicate and create something that one could call a synaptic experience in some way, that you can hear the voice of someone else without being in front of the person or without seeing him with a sense of the eyes, but with another device or with another set of devices or another apparatus. I wanted to quote something from Norbert Wiener, from Die menschliche Art mit menschlichen Wesen umzugehen, 1950, The Human Use of Human Beings, where he suggested that actually he could transfer an architect through telegraph lines. And he said that the idea that one might conceivably travel by telegraph in addition to traveling by train, and here we're back to the Deutsche Bahn, or airplane, is not intrinsically absurd. So there was this fascination at that time that also Liza Blackman reports upon in her critique of Masumi's attunement notion, in regards to the UK spiritualist church, that many people in the 30s and 40s had the feeling that telepresence or some kind of synaptic contact to or experience to things would be a step forward. And what I would like to just quote quickly Liza Blackman, and then I come to two final questions to introduce for a discussion. Liza Blackman says, the voice hearer would subtly shift, this is a description of what happened at UK spiritualist church meetings, their attention and focus to feelings, sensations, rhythms, and movements which would allow them to attune to the more pre-verbal and intensive dimensions of the voices. This attunement might take place within an associated milieu known as the development circle, which connects the group members such that they might experience a flow of energy within the room or particular setting. The voices move and circulate between group members and the living and the dead, and to that extent become shared rather than isolated, singular experiences. Pierre, this is nothing with optics, but it's the other dimension. It is the haptic, the sounds, the feelings in the body, and so forth. And Pierre Cassou-Nogues will, in his speech, talk a lot about this, his concept about this synaptic experience. Why, this is the first question, is it possible that Masumi, when he tells us about affective politics and about affective attunement, has a completely blind spot in regard to what Nazi propaganda and people like Leni Riefenstahl did in regard to attunement? Why does he not tell us that there are other sources or roots of this word and of this notion than Deleuze and Stern? Because he, I think, must know that this attunement notion was very popular in the 30s and 40s. So my first question would be, is it possible to think about attunement in a Masumian way without looking at these phenomena from another decade? And my short answer would be no, it's not possible. The second question is a bit wider. Why is it that there seem to be certain waves where this phenomenon of non-visual communication, telecommunication, has a very, very strong popularity, or as Masumi would call it, a wave of energy? And my feeling is that in the 40s, it had a lot to do with these new technologies of TV and radio that became really popular and widely accessible to many people, to amateurs also as well as to professionals. So that there was a technological drive towards suggesting that presence and face-to-face contact is not any longer essential for our communication. And for nowadays, that's rather a question to all of you. Is there again maybe a technological drive that promotes that we think that attunement must be something that is essential for our communication? Thank you.
Thanks a lot for this rich, I the imaginaries of esoterics. Thank you, Matthias. So again, short questions to concerning Matthias' talk. Yeah.
Very short question indeed. Can you do you trace back this God-patient chiropracticing to Mesmer also?
That would be possible actually, because with Mesmer the same thing happened, that he first had hands on the patient healing sessions, and that he then kind of promoted this distance. It's a very good point. I think Mesmer is an interesting case to observe.
The micro. Okay, there.
I just wanted to add to this discussion about Masumi and his application of affected human, that affected human from Stern, and also how Masumi applies it, has very much to do about differentiation. And I know hardly any other theorist who says as clearly as Masumi does that there is no sameness in affect. There is just difference in affect. I mean, we of course would have to discuss that, but... Did you hear me? No.
It's not very loud.
Sorry, I didn't hold it rightly. Masumi says very clearly that there is no sameness in affect. There are no two same affects that are the same. And I think that's important to add if you discuss certain, let's say, probably fascistic tendencies in affect theory.
You mean you had this multiplicity of experiences?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
And constant differentiation. And that's what he picks up from Daniel Stern as well.
Yeah.
Because when two people are tuned to each other, like mother and child, in the classical definition by Stern, they all have, of course, the different activation contours and affect contours.
Yeah.
It's just that they form a kind of dialogue that just doesn't use language in the first place.
I know, but this is actually an internal discussion that is going on for quite some time within the research network. Bernd is very skeptical of my proposition, because he says, but Masumi has this differentiation of different ways of how the attunement works. But I think also the Nazis had this differentiation. If you, for example, look at what Goebbels said in 1942 in the Sportpalast-Rede about total mobilization and the total war, he was creating something like a wide wave of energy, of attunement, but he completely acknowledged that his audience was very, very differentiated. So he does not address his audience as German soldiers. We now are in a phase of the war. But he starts his speech with, whom do I see here in front of me? The German woman, the worker from the steel engines, the foreign guest workers. I mean, that's a very cynical notion of how he addressed the Polish slaves and war slaves. The young ones, the old ones, the teachers, the intellectuals. We all have come together here, and you will all have different ways of seeing it to discuss this thing, not to discuss this thing, but to get into the next phase of the war. So for the Nazis, there was also a differentiation. You shake your head?
But maybe we don't start the dialogue.
No, not yet.
Yeah.
Maybe if it's a very brief one, because it doesn't make me to...
If I understand right, your idea would also, for instance, criticism of Deleuze. And in the last chapter of Mille Plateaux, again, Deleuze would see the optics as a kind of the optics is the bad guy who kind of dominates the territory where he makes map, whereas the haptics is the good guy who's the nomad and who in the end is going to be colonized by the optics. I mean, that's, grossly spoken, the idea. And you would say that, in fact, in this stress in descent phases put on haptics and a kind of attunement, which is in fact haptics, there is another story, and which would be related to Nazism. Am I understanding right, or is it an illegitimate extension of what you were saying?
Not necessarily Nazism alone, but also some kind of spiritual thinking, very strange esoterics. I think there's a wide range of influences into this notion of attunement that is usually not talked about, not by the others, and not by Masumi also.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. And now we move on to the third and last part of this panel on it's perfect, because later on in my paper I will talk about how technology scripts our behavior, and I think that's a perfect example of, I need to stand in front of the micro, otherwise it doesn't work. Yeah, I'm not saying, that's again a scripting of behavior, but that was a kind of a footnote. The next contribution is by Sandra Wachter. She is a law and postdoctoral researcher in data ethics and algorithms at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. She is also a policy advisor for governments and NGOs, and her research, the core of her research circles around law and ethics of big data, AI, and robotics. And that's also the title of your presentation for today. Thank you, Sandra, for coming.
Hello, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and to be talking about a couple of research topics that I'm focusing on. I have to admit I'm not a philosopher, I'm a lawyer, so excuse me. But I tried to give you a couple of things I've been working on, and I think it's very important that we think about those things, because at the moment in Europe at least we see that regulation kind of fails in taking into account the risks of AI and robotics and big data. So I want to give you a brief overview of what I want to cover. I can only touch on these topics briefly, but I'm hoping to find more time during the discussion. I want to talk about AI and regulation in the European frameworks, and specific the European Data Protection Regulation, which will come into force of next year. The civil law rules of robotics in the European Union, we currently have a draft on the way that considers new regulation for smart robotics, so robotics that have AI innate capabilities. And if I have time, I want to touch on a couple of ethical questions around that. But let me start off with a brief overview of a couple of sectors where we see an increase of use of AI, robotics, automated decision-making, and big data. So if you look, for example, in the workplace, if you nowadays apply for a job or if you apply for university, it's very likely that an algorithm is going to filter out the CVs. An algorithm is going to make a decision whether you're going to get a job, for example. Similarly, criminal justice, predictive policing is getting more and more famous. So the question of whether you should be granted parole if you're going to be arrested for something. Okay, sure. Okay, slower. In the criminal justice sector, we see that judges, for example, use AI and algorithms to decide if somebody should be granted parole, if somebody should go to prison, how long they should go for prison. We also see that robotics are being used in the criminal sector, for example, for patrolling. Healthcare sector is also a very increasing sector where we use algorithms for disease prediction, treatment plans, surgical robots. Transport, very important, because we see that algorithms are being used for autonomous cars, for example. Finance and banking sector is also very important. So nowadays, if you apply for a loan, it's very likely that an algorithm will determine if you're going to default on the loan or not. So what those things have in common is they all use big data, they make decisions about us, and they are very, very smart. Why are we using those techniques? Because AI and robotics have advantages over human decision making. They can help us to make more accurate decisions. They can make us make more consistent decisions, and they are cost and time effective. But the problem is that AI comes with disadvantages, and one of the biggest disadvantages is that AI is a black box. AI is very hard to understand, it's very opaque, inscrutable, and has inherent biases, and is a source of discrimination. So one of the legal questions that we're struggling with at the moment is, what is it that we actually expect when we use AI and smart robotics? And we want them to make fairer, accountable, and transparent decisions, which is at odds with the nature of the technology itself. So in Europe, and actually around the world, there has been a discussion about what can be done to deliver those parameters. And one of the ideas is to make those systems explainable. If I make a decision about you and you have to lay out the reasons why you made this decision, this could help to make decisions more accountable and transparent. So moving what's happening on the European level, there is a discussion if we should have a legally mandated so-called right to explanation. That would mean if you are applying for a loan, you don't get the loan, you are entitled to get an explanation. And there has been an ongoing discussion currently whether the new data protection framework will give us something like that. But before I go into the details of the framework, I just wanted to think about the types of explanations that we can think about. Explanations is a very vague term. It could either be that I have to explain to you how a system works, and I can tell you about the reasons that led to my decision. These are two different things. And of course, both are very important in order to make AI more transparent. Here is something that has been flying around in the media, in governmental reports, in research papers, that scholars and politicians believe that the new data protection framework will give us a right to explanation, a legally binding right to explanation, which would be a major step forward. I was very skeptical, and me and a couple of colleagues looked into this topic in more depth, and we wrote a paper that is called Why Right to Explanation Does Not Exist. It's a very long paper, it's publicly available, I cannot go into the details, but what we found is that the new framework has major loopholes that can be exploited to completely get rid of all the safeguards that are currently in there. Just to give you a brief idea of what is actually legally required, you're not going to have a right to explanation about an individual decision. The only thing that you are going to have is something that could be termed as a right to be informed. A right to be informed means that before a decision is being made about you, a company has to inform you. So basically saying, okay, I'm planning to make a decision about you. But this safeguard will only apply if the decision is solely automated. That means there is no decision in the human, there is no human in the loop in the decision-making process, which is a major loophole. Because if you think about the most common application, there is usually a human in the loop. If you think about the CV filtering example, what usually happens, an algorithm ranks the CVs, and then a human makes the final decision. This would not be a solely automated decision anymore. The other problem is that you're only going to be informed about prospective automated decisions if they have legal or other significant effects. It's not really clear what that means. What is a significant effect? To whom? You know, what's the standard here? So that's our opinion as to why a legally binding right to explanation is not forthcoming. The main reason, again, I cannot go into detail, is, and that's the most important part, is these are the sections in the framework that deal with AI and automated decision making. And the text in the red says that we should be entitled to obtain an explanation after a decision. The problem is that this is in recital 71, and for those who are not lawyers, recitals are not legally binding. So this is basically a guideline. This means they could give you an explanation if they want to, but they're not legally required to do so. And the interesting part, and this is why I'm mentioning in this, is the European Parliament actually saw that loophole and tried to make it legally binding, but it was not adopted in the end. So this was a conscious decision to make this law weaker than it had been. There are ideas of making decision-making a bit more transparent. As I said, you have to be informed before a decision is being made about you. And to give you an example of what the European Union thinks meaningful information about algorithm means, and I think that's very funny, is this. So these are a couple of icons that are proposed that you should get as soon as data is collected about you, that should inform you of what's going to happen with your data. I don't think that's going to be particularly helpful if you don't get a job or if you don't get a loan, because that's not really an explanation. That's very simplistic. So I think that's a major problem here. But again, this was not the only framework that thought about making automated decision-making more transparent and accountable. We also have the same discussion with regards to robotics. So the question is, maybe we're going to have a right to explanation for robotics. And there was a very promising proposal recently, also by the European Union, brought forward by the European Parliament, which is the civil law rules on robotics. So again, robotics in the sense of smart robotics that have AI capabilities. This was proposed early this year, and there was one section in the draft that I found very intriguing. I'm going to display this here. It was section 7, and the highlighted text says that the European Parliament calls on the European Commission to make laws that make the right to obtain an explanation legally binding. So we figured that would be very interesting. If the data protection framework doesn't give us this, maybe rules for robotics will give us a right to explanation. And it might sound odd, but it could actually be very helpful, because a right to explanation for robotics would be sensible. As I said, you have, for example, policing robots. If a policing robot identifies you as a threat, you might want to know why. If an autonomous car has a crash, you might want to know why. If a surgical robot makes a procedure on you and something fails, you might want to know why. Same comes true for weapons. So this would be interesting, but as you can imagine, I looked into this as well, and I'm very skeptical, because we wrote another paper saying why we think this is also not forthcoming. This was recently published, I think, 2 months ago in Science Robotics, where we again pointed out the loopholes in the current framework. And one of the main reasons why we think it's not forthcoming is because the European Parliament took that section out again. So it was proposed, but the Parliament didn't pass it. So this means you can see that even though legislators in Europe do understand that explainability of inscrutable systems is important, they are very, very hesitant to move forward with this. So we are in a very bad situation here. But I think this is not the end of the discussion. Actually, it should be the starting point of the discussion, because the question remains, should we have a right to explanation? Should we do this? And the question is, how can we balance this? Because we don't want to stifle innovation, we don't want to stifle research. Too much regulation could do that. There's a valid concern that if you make systems too explainable, you might, are at odds with performance. And the same comes true with trade secrets or manipulation. If I disclose too much about an algorithm to you, I could infringe upon trade secrets, or I could open the system up to a manipulation. I don't buy that argument either. I think there are ways of making systems more explainable, making them more accountable. And just yesterday, I published that paper saying that we could have explanations that would give us accountability without the need to understand how a system works, without the need to disclose the algorithm fully, without the need to fully understand how a neural net works. So there are situations where you can do that. Again, if we cannot make those systems explainable, if that's really not true, and I don't believe that, we have to think about alternatives, because I think it's very, very harmful to use AI systems and the opacity of those systems as an excuse to say, oh, well, they are just inscrutable, let's move on. So we have to think about alternatives. So what could be done? We could think about watchdogs, for example. You could think about an AI watchdog that would scrutinize companies if they're using algorithms. You could think about internal audits, ethics boards, for example, inside of companies. You could also think about certification schemes or standards that would give us a minimum requirements for such systems. So there is a lot of that can be done. At the moment, I see that everybody is very hesitant to do something because nobody wants to regulate AI because it's so novel and has so much promise. But this is just an idea from the regulatory things. I want to touch upon 3 points that are more from the ethical side, because this is just the law side. More importantly, and I think that's under research as well, is what is the ethics of AI and robotics? What are we actually doing when we're inviting those systems in our society? So one of the biggest questions that nobody really talks about is automation actually ethical? Should we do this in a society? Everybody's more of the opinion the genie's out of the bottle, this is now here, let's deal with it. But the question of should we really do this? What does automation mean to a society? When can we rely on those systems? Is it ethical that an algorithm is sending you to prison? Is it ethical that an autonomous weapon decides whether somebody should die or not? This is a very important problem, and nobody's really discussing this, at least from a legal perspective. Another ethical issue is ethical design. If we decide to invite those systems in our society, how can we design them in an ethical way? One of the examples, for example, that has been given with AI assistants. So this is not my example, but a colleague of me mentioned that if you think about Alexa, for example, which is an AI assistant, from a gender viewpoint, how do we feel about that fact that this is a woman's voice, that we're actually training society to give comments to women? Is that something that is ethical? Should we move forward? Why is it called Alexa? Why is it not called something gender neutral, for example? An interesting question. Same comes true for toys and weapons. How should we design them in an ethical way? Should we make sure that we're always aware that this is a robot? Should they be allowed to look human-like? Very, very different opinions in Europe and Asia, for example. So ethical design is another important consideration. And the last thing is also something that nobody really wants to talk about is what does automation mean for us as a society and the workforce? If we're starting to automate all jobs, how are we going to deal with that? Is it really enough to re-educate everyone? If I have been a cab driver for 20 years and now Uber is taking over with autonomous cars, at the age of 50, am I gonna be able to reskill myself and find another job? Does that mean we should stop automation? Are there things that can be done? Should we think about universal basic income, for example? Finland is trying that at the moment. Should we tax automation? So there's a lot of things going on, and I think from a legal perspective, there's a lot to do because regulation is very flawed at the moment. But more importantly, I think we need to think about the ethical considerations as well that are heavily under research at the moment. Thank you.
So thank you, Sandra. And again, the floor is open for 1-2 short questions, and then we going a short overall discussion. Thank you for the Richard and
thank you for your talk. It is super important, mostly because an algorithm is not deprived of power or of relations that shape its mechanisms. Furthermore, algorithms that are used for for decision making that directly impacts human lives. Another thing is they can be changed. So as long as an algorithm is not is not under any sort of regulation, as long as there is no sort of control on it, how often can it be reshaped? Can it be reshaped without public knowledge? Who pays for that? I mean, the engineers who are gonna create and design the system, they do not have the power. They're the executive tool. They are ordered by whom? That's my question. Like, where do you see the power lying if algorithms are not subjective to accountability in any way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I'm struggling to answer that myself. I think what happens at the moment is that we are hesitant to regulate them because we think if we do that, the economy is going to collapse. And everybody thinks that AI is going to solve all the problems, so we should not touch this magical unicorn at all. Actually, what's even more important than that, because it's not so much just from a regulatory perspective, it's also that the private sector has too much power at the moment. Germany is one of the countries in Europe that has at least some jurisprudence on that, so people have been going to court. So there are a couple of interesting cases where people went to court because they didn't get a loan, and they wanted to know how their credit score was issued and like what the parameters were. And they went to court, and the judges said, well, we can't tell you that because it would infringe on trade secrets. So this is not a question of, okay, should we use systems that are inscrutable? This is a question of should we disclose? Because there are two reasons why you don't want to give information about an algorithm. Either because you can't, because AI is inscrutable, and that's one problem, or because you don't want to. And the don't want to part relies with the trade secret. So basically, they could tell me why I didn't get the loan. They just don't want to because it would hurt their business model. And I think this is something where you can do something, because you can do a lot with tech to open up the black box. It's more a political will if you don't want to, if we protect trade secrets more than transparency.
Yeah, I have a similar, in a way, comment and question. First, I think it's really important work that you're doing. This has troubled me for a long time in the kind of untrammeled application of these kinds of algorithms, leading from, well, I mean, Facebook and social media, as we talked about, being one example of that, and that's being investigated now, but then moving forward to things like automated cars, which I find terrifying in this respect. And I guess I have two questions. One, I'm interested to know if you know if there's anything happening in the US along these lines. And two, but really the sort of more significant maybe question would be, the law is a very conservative and slow institution, and so I think it's really difficult for it to keep up with these new developments. But what has to happen, it seems, is that precedents in other areas have to be applied to these new technologies. So to take your loan example, if there currently is a law that says that you have a right to know why you were turned down for a loan, it seems to me then you know, that should be fairly direct in terms of figuring out how to deal with that information in the case where loans are automated. When it comes to things like digital assistants, which is more, as you said, an ethical or design question, or automated cars, then the question of responsibility seems to me gets perhaps more complicated. Is it the driver if the driver's not driving? Is it the owner? Is it the creator of the algorithms and so forth? Anyway, I just, I think it's really crucial that we need to do this, and I find it with you exasperating that there's such a refusal to put any curbs on new development. If it's technically possible, it seems to be allowed.
Yeah, so excellent point, and I think I could stand here and talk about this for like 3 hours, but I try to keep myself short. With regard to the US, I think the US is even more hesitant to do something because they have a very, let's call it soft touch approach. Like the US is not really fond of strict regulation in general. They try to do this with, let's say, ethical guidelines and safety standards, which basically means self-regulation. So it means, okay, Facebook, you come up with guidelines and you follow them. Like, I'm European, I don't believe that the person that should be regulated should set up the framework under which they operate. That's an odd thing. But that's a US approach, right? That's different. Interestingly enough, and this is, I don't want to bash the US too much here, because actually they care about those things too. There have been at least 3 reports in the last couple of months before Trump that actually addressed those issues of fairness, transparency, accountability, even touched upon the question of how it's going to impact the workforce. This is now on hold because we have Trump, or they have Trump, I don't. So there's at least something. They have issued a couple of guidelines now on driverless cars, again, guidelines, but it's doing something. They're not completely oblivious to that thing. The other thing, I have to say this, first of all, because I believe it, and second of all, because I'm a lawyer. I think it's a very faulty argument to say that law always lags behind. It's politics that slows law down. It's the compromises that we have to make because we are Europe and it just takes longer. But I have to say, that doesn't need to be the case. In fact, the UK is currently adopting the new data protection framework and has now issued amendments. And the paper that I wrote was influential there as well. And they have now put in a proposal to make a legally binding right to explanation before the framework even goes into place. So we could be ahead of the curve. This is a political decision, it's not a legal decision, because the knowledge is there, the experts are there, everybody's warning about those things. It's more like, are we going to move forward? So if the UK does that, it will be world leading in that regard. And I really hope they do that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Sandra. Maybe to bring a brief 10 minutes, because we started late, and I think we should have an overall discussion, and to bring back also remind you of the first two, thank you, Sandra, presentation, and maybe where I don't know whether I would start like that, but I mean, the question was, what are phenomena of irrationalities, of, as Matthias put it, affect esoterics, and at the same time, I remember I was part of a big conference of autonomous weapon systems, and what was my experience that the laws really struggled with these systems in terms of responsibility. And the background for me is being in science and technology studies, which we discussed for maybe like 20 years, that there is no sole agency of the subject or the sole agency of the technology, but hybrid agencies. And that seems to be very difficult to struggle with, which brings me back to the question of what is, you could say, the ontology and the epistemology of law it works with today, and does it still fit to the problems we have here? So that will be, but I think first Markus wanted to...
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just butt in there, because from a philosophical standpoint, many things that you talked about so very intricately can be boiled down to the trolley problem. You mentioned the trolley problem. Because someone said, I forgot the name, it was some famous cybernetics guy, who said everything that can be decided is already decided. So what really is the problem are those things that can't be decided. And the questions that you are concerned about, and it is no wonder that people are reluctant to talk about it and and don't come to terms with it, because the main decision has already been made. When illustrated at the trolley problem is, are we all acquainted to the trolley problem? It's about the train watchman, a train which is, there are many versions of the trolley problem, but the classical one is, there's a train coming, and there's a watchman at a station who has a lever to decide, and there are two tracks that the train can go to. The one has a wagon of 20 people, and on the other track there are just two train workers. So the watchman can decide with his lever what he can decide. And the problem is, in philosophical, there are very, very intricate, as you might suggest, very intricate logical solutions about this. But the problem is that the watchman can't decide right. You have many scenarios where you can think, okay, the track where the 20 people are, there are 20 serial killers, and the other track are two Peace Nobel Prize players. So you can decide according to some contingent reason, but there's no logical way to decide right. And the problem is, And this is where the computer comes in as a medium. The problem is not what you can ask the watchman, and you can put him in front of the law and question him. But the problem is that he already is in the position where he has to decide. And that's what computers are doing for us. They make things decidable that weren't decidable before. And that's the problem. And this is why we can't come to an end with a discussion about internal relations and what is wrong and what can be decided and so on. How do we cope with this?
Is it? Yeah, that's an excellent question. That's an excellent question, and I like very much how you framed it, because I think this is where law and ethics overlap, because I totally agree with you that AI now gives us the opportunity to make a decision consciously that we wouldn't be able to do in real life scenarios. If I'm driving down the road and I have to make this decision right now, I'm just gonna do something. And how the law usually dealt with it is it would just excuse you, right? So if you're driving down a path and you either have to kill 5 women or 2 men, either way, because there is no right and wrong, you will be excused, because you have been in a very stressful situation, emergency situation, and you just needed to handle something and there is no right solution, right? But this state of emergency does not apply when we use algorithms, because we code them before we deploy them. So now we are being forced to answer questions that we have been shying away from and that we didn't need to address because the state of emergency wasn't there. And this is an excellent point. Now we can answer those questions. And you can see it from a utilitarian perspective and say, of course, 3 people are more important than 2. You could say, okay, that like Kant, there's no way you cannot, weigh those things against them. Interestingly enough, the MIT has a research project called The Moral Machine, I think. And they tried to test, because they wanted to know what people actually think. I guess intuitively we would say, well, you either go, you would go with minimizing harm. That I think, at least that was my perception. What they found, though, is that the people who participated in the research said, I don't care who I harm, I just want to survive. So, this is a fair argument too, right? So, but this is the question, if this is what the individual wants, like kill as many as possible as long as I'm unharmed, what does that mean for the market? What if like Mercedes says like, okay, we're gonna cater for that. We're gonna build machines that always prioritize the driver now. So, that's one thing. Then you have Mercedes, which is a good brand. Then you can have like other brands not good with cars, like let's say Fiat or whatever, like some Smart, okay. Smart will not have the same resources like Mercedes to make their system as safe. Is it okay that you can pay for safety? It just poses a lot of questions that I have no answers to. But I think it's very important that we keep this in mind, because I absolutely agree AI is asking questions that we did not need to answer beforehand.
This is a very profound way of thinking about it, and it's a very profound way of asking this question, because the case of emergency, you can frame it as emergency, but this is a kind of human condition that we are dealing not with emergency, but with contingency. We are always in a complex field which we cannot decide. If you are about to have a car crash, you're not decided, you are reacting. You are not rationally deciding who you kill. And this isn't because the humans are bad and they just think about themselves. It's just that they're reacting and not deciding rationally. And so the famous problem with the car is, ethically, you would have to implement an AI that sacrifices the owner for the greater good of other participants in traffic. But who would buy such a car? This is the place, yeah.
Yosha?
to say specifically to that topic that I found in the literature about robotics and how they want to implement emotional aspects in this robotic AIs, that this problem that you are discussing is one key argument to try to implement kind of affect systems into robotic autonomous systems. Because they say there are decisions that have to be decided and they cannot be rationally decided, so we need to implement affect into robotic AI so we can make decisions, or the machines can then make decisions that are not based on their rational programming but on their affective systems. So it's especially this kind of problem that you're discussing, why so many people in robotic research from cognitive science and behavioral science and neuroscience say, okay, we need this next step of AI, this emotional or affective robot for this kind of decisions.
I mean, the problem is if you talk to people who develop AI, they freak out when they hear something like that because they're mathematicians and they need clear rules. In ethics and in moral, we don't have, it's a gray area. Like, coding is black or white, yes, no, 0, 1. And if you cannot give an answer, there's hardly any ethical question that you can answer with 0 or 1s. And I think this is the main problem why we as a society want those systems to be, ethical, responsible, and where the coders say, how the hell am I going to do that? And give me a framework, and nobody has a framework because we don't even agree on the same ethical, moral standards. Like, not just globally, but even within Europe. You can, or for example, privacy is one example, and I think I can relate to that very much. I was born in Vienna, and my father is from Germany, so like the notion of privacy and what data protection means to me is clearly flavored by my upbringing. I moved to the UK now, it's different there. And they are still part of the European Union, but like you would consider this is a European country, and they could not be more on the opposite side when it comes to data protection and privacy. There are more cameras in London than people. So even though they have the human right to privacy, even though they have the same data protection laws, the notion of what that means, the value of privacy, is so different and within the same, basically, continent. So let alone finding, and this is just, let's call it privacy, other things like who is more important, 2 people, 3 men, 1 pregnant woman, 1 old lady, that's so much more complicated. I do not dare to think that we could even start to begin to code those things because we don't have any consensus on morals.
And maybe to make the story even more complicated, when you were saying, okay, these computer scientists, they are more or less mathematicians and it's about zeros and ones, I cooperate with a computer scientist who is into machine learning, and if you look at data-driven algorithms, these people tell you we actually don't know what the algorithms are doing because it's depending on the context, on the interaction with the user, on the data which are provided. And now there are starting research projects trying to figure out what, for example, neural networks are doing because actually they don't know, which makes your question of the right to be informed or question of explainability even more complicated. And maybe just to take back the curve to Matthias' presentation, I was wondering yourself, because you were talking about the 1940s and people were so much occupied with telepresence. And now I was asking myself why we are so occupied with auto-management, because you said, I mean, there is the hope that we can solve so many problems with automatic management of systems. But the question is, are we kind of obsessed with these ideas of auto-management? Because you ask yourself, might there be realms of life where we don't want and where we don't need these systems? But I think Gabriele was asking, Gabriele? No? Question.
So I would doubt the narration of the rationality of algorithms and decision-making by algorithms because you always have programmers. You always have programmers who program the algorithms, and also who set also for artificial intelligence the condition of the possibility of making automated decisions. And it's a heavily interest-driven, by companies or by agencies or whatever, heavily interest-driven business of setting the thresholds for the algorithms. And what we want to know is the thresholds for the algorithm, why I get the loan or why I don't get the loan. And therefore, if the law is really surrendering completely to the business and not getting insight into these decisions, which are only partly automatized, because the thresholds are never automatized. This is what you want to frame, because this is your policy or your economy. So I would doubt what Markus said, that algorithms can make something decidable which we cannot decide. Maybe your example is a bit
too... I didn't talk about algorithms. I didn't mean algorithms. There are algorithms even before digital media. I was not talking about algorithms per se. I was talking about the technical foundations of the computer.
Yeah, but the story that algorithms are rational is they are completely, if you can say, they are irrational in a way, because they are so interest-driven by companies who build the algorithms. And this is a very interesting, so there is a very interesting connection also to the Sublime. So when you surrender and say, we have no chance to look into the algorithm and to make them, what you say, explainable, then it's because, as you know, Kant defined the Sublime as the surrender to the sheer quantity of something. So it's the sheer quantity of decisions made in millions, in part of millions of seconds by the algorithms, which we completely surrender us to them. I don't know if I make clear what the point is, but it's not that rational as we think.
Can I just, one thing? Because
I'm sorry, and now I have the bad part in this, but I think it's a wonderful discussion, but I want to ask you to be a little bit more patient, because later on in the afternoon, I think we have another panel which touch on this question again, because now it's nearly 1:20, and I think so that everybody can have at least a short lunch, I need to interrupt here and thank the three of you for your wonderful presentations and for you for coming and for the discussion, and we will go on later with that discussion. I'm sorry about that. So
thank you.
Have a nice lunch.